Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is actually someone who, without whom this would have never been possible. Muslimish would not have even existed if it wasn't for Maryam Namazie's support. She's saying it's not true. Okay, she was very, very pivotal for it to start. She supported Ibrahim Abdullah in getting it started along with other founders of the group. Actually, Maryam Namazie is so pivotal in the start of ex-Muslim organizations around the world. There is a gathering of ex-Muslims in London that I attended last year and has been going on prior to that, which is the largest gathering of ex-Muslims ever. And she has truly, truly built a tremendous community, and she connects people internationally in ways that are astounding, really. So Maryam Namazie is a British-Iranian writer and activist. Her early work focused on human rights violations in Sudan, Turkey, and Iran. And she has actively campaigned against Sharia law. She's written numerous articles about women's rights, free expression, Islamism, and secularism. She's a very strong proponent, I think, of secularism. And she led a topless protest at Pride London in 2017, which I know caused many, many ripples. She's currently the spokesperson for Fitna Movement for Women's Liberation, One Law for All, and the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain. And she hosts a weekly television program in Persian and English called Bread and Roses. Please do find that on YouTube. Please help me welcome Maryam Namazie.
Guys, okay, I'm sure you're all so exhausted. I don't need any instruments to do this. Can you put my I do it for myself now, just to make it easy. Well, before this starts, I do want to say that I am really sorry, but I am going to offend some people. And I am going to say things that are uncomfortable, and I think it should be okay, because I've heard a lot of things that have made me uncomfortable. And that's just part of having this discussion. So I hope we can try to somehow reach some ground and try to understand each other, even if we won't always agree. I do think that when we're critical of things, though, it's not necessarily that we're judging someone, but I think we're giving our opinion on things, and that's what this space is meant to be. So one can be critical, for example, of the veil and not be judging someone who's veiled, you know. So I know Zahra and I, we've had lots of conversations on Twitter, and she agrees with me on a lot of points, and I agree with her on a lot of points. I think if we can look at it in this way, that we're having discussions, we're criticizing things whilst at the same time holding each other sacred, but not beliefs, not practices. I think we can move very much further if that's the case. Oh, I need my PowerPoint. Oh, you came and you went and you got the same thing.
Sorry, I thought there was a video. That's okay.
It's right next to my, yeah. Okay, so. Sorry, I'm just going to, you know, when the discussion on community came about, I have a big problem with identity politics and communities as they stand. So I wanted to talk about building a community in protest, which is how I look at the ex-Muslim movement. And again, you know, not every ex-Muslim agrees with me, because we are not a homogeneous group either. We have lots of disagreements, and so you'll find that you might agree with some things I say, even if you're a believer, and you'll disagree with me vehemently if you're an ex-Muslim. I know some people were saying, we're ex-Muslim and we want to get divorced from Maryam Namazie. You know, so yeah, so it's just about, you know, raising important issues and ideas which I think are important to us. So I want to start with the Council of Ex-Muslims. It's now 11 years since it started. It's June of 2007 was when it first started. So this month is our 11th anniversary. Woohoo! And when we started, it was basically really difficult to find 25 people who would show their names and faces and say that, you know, we're atheists from Muslim backgrounds, we've left Islam, we don't want to believe anymore. It was really difficult. And I think now we're seeing a colossal rise in an international ex-Muslim community. But I always put community in quotes because for me, it's never been about community as identity politics understands it, or as multiculturalism as a social policy understands it, which is people boxed into these really confined, restricted, imagined communities with culturally relative rights and also run by so-called community leaders that are judge, jury, and executioner all in one. So when I speak of community, for me, I mean a community in protest. So if I would be more accurate, I would call it a movement. And it's, for me, about demanding social change and justice. Like the LGBT movement, like the anti-slavery, anti-colonial movement, like the anti-apartheid movement, like the suffragette movement, or the civil rights movement here in the US. So none of these movements were about privileging groups or asserting superiority and difference. And for me, actually, this idea of difference and superiority are one and the same. They are actually double-edged swords of the same thing. Because when you insist on difference, there is a level of insisting on superiority as well. And I think that's where we're going very wrong with identity politics. But these movements were all about insisting on our common identity, our common humanity, and on equal rights, equality. And in fact, these movements came about in response to those who wanted to say that, who were insisting that people are unequal, that some were superior and others were not. So community in protest for me is a movement that's insisting on freedom from religion as well as freedom from religion, freedom of conscience, the right to apostasy, the right to blasphemy, and to do it without fear of losing one's life or safety, not privilege, not superiority, and not to be treated differently, but equally to others of faith and none. And I think, this movement is important only because in 13 states, Islamic states, all of them, atheism is punishable by death. Because even in cases of violent murder, Islamic law will accept, blood money or diya, but will never accept it in the case, this sort of discretion, so-called discretion when it comes to apostasy and blasphemy. That's how seriously it looks at this issue. And even in countries like Bangladesh, where there isn't the death penalty for atheism or apostasy and blasphemy, you see that a lot of free thinkers are getting killed, and they're not even being held accountable, because very often you see that atheists are seen to be fair game. Just a few days ago, a Bangladeshi atheist poet and publisher, Shahsahan Bachu, he was dragged out of a shop and shot to death. So this movement matters because in Iran, for example, in just 1 year, 160,000 websites were shut down for promoting atheism and corruption. Because there are people like Sina Dehqan or Sohail Arabi, Saeed Maliku, who are on death row for blasphemy and apostasy. Because in Egypt, there are two government ministries that are working together to see how they can eradicate and confront atheism. Because, as was mentioned earlier, you've got someone like Sharif Jaber, who's been missing since the 2nd of May for his atheist blogging. Because a Malaysian government minister has said that atheists should be hunted down and re-educated, because in Pakistan, a high court has equated blasphemy with terrorism. And there are lots of people in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, who are facing apostasy and, blasphemy charges. So you've got people like Ayaz Nizami, Rana Noman, and in fact, after they were charged with blasphemy, hanged Ayaz Nizami went viral on Twitter. So this movement matters because there are a series of laws in Saudi Arabia, for example, which defines terrorism as calling for atheist thought in any form. Because you've got someone like Al-Shamri in his 20s sentenced to death in Saudi Arabia for atheism. This movement matters because you can be killed for leaving and criticizing Islam. Full stop. That's reason enough. I don't need to explain anymore why we need to have an ex-Muslim movement. For me, this is a battle that's going on, not a clash of civilizations, as the far right likes to say, because Donald Trump will definitely be on the side of the Islamists, as will the Hindu right, murdering Muslims for eating beef, as will the Buddhist right, murdering Muslims in Myanmar, as will the Jewish right, erasing women from photos because they don't want women to be seen or heard, as will the Christian right, and so on and so forth. So for me, this is not a clash of civilizations, but a clash between the theocrats and those who are secularists and free thinkers. And I think secularism is an important, a very, very important principle for us. And I'm sorry to see how many of us are not comfortable with that. And I think that's something that will really be one of the minimum preconditions for the freedoms and rights we're all fighting for. So I want to show you a piece from Islam's Non-Believers on the importance of this movement.
There's a battle going on in Muslim communities in Britain and across the Islamic world. A hidden struggle between religious fundamentalists and a group of people who are heading in the opposite direction. They are ex-Muslims, people who are leaving Islam entirely. They are forced to live in the shadows.
They locked me in the house and they hit me. I don't think it would be that hard for them to kill me.
I have 4 head stabs, like machete wounds on my head. You are going to get shunned. You are going to get mistreated.
I found an underground resistance movement who defy fundamentalists here and across the Islamic world.
Internet and social media is our battleground. Our numbers are growing each and every day.
Just because we're silent doesn't mean we don't exist.
The hellfire is waiting for anyone who is rejecting Allah and His Messenger. Moreover, their families, they should not continue having any kind of relationship with them.
This is a time bomb of young people who are being traumatized, really. So, you know, this issue of atheism as well in many of our regions, the Middle East, North Africa, we're seeing that there's a huge rise in the number of atheists. And I think part of it comes from a lived experience of living under the sort of authoritarianism and this totalitarianism, really, where everything, you know, when they say the personal is political, where everything you do becomes an act of political resistance, as they see it, against either Islam or the state. And what we really are seeing now is this ex-Muslim movement, which is a widespread movement of people who are refusing to stay in the shadows any longer. They're speaking out in unprecedented ways, particularly via social media. And as I've said before, you know, social media has been really instrumental in giving people access to information that they didn't have before, and also connecting people together, empowering them to mobilize and to work together. So, as was mentioned earlier, you know, Islam is doing, social media is doing to Islam what the printing press did to Christianity. And whilst it's very hard to know the exact numbers of atheists, because obviously given all the threats and intimidations, you know, I believe there's a tsunami of atheism in our regions. And if you look at just the God Delusion, 3.3 million copies of the God Delusion were sold worldwide. Now this is a bestseller internationally, but the Arabic version has been downloaded 13 million times. This is hugely, we're talking about hugely different numbers. If you look at a 2012 WIN Gallup International Global Index of Religiosity and Atheism, you found, for example, a quarter of people interviewed in Saudi Arabia described themselves as not religious, and 5 to 9% said that they were convinced atheists. So if you extrapolate from this number, you'll see that there are 1,500,000 atheists in Saudi Arabia, 4 million in Pakistan, and these are both countries where atheism is punished by the death penalty. So for me, fundamentally, the ex-Muslim movement is important because of these realities, but also it's about demanding not privilege but equal rights, the right to conscience, the right to thought. Whether you know, the freedom of religion includes very much so the freedom to be free from religion, to to not be discriminated against, not to be shunned, not to be killed because you don't want to believe in religion anymore. And one of the things that I find is that even though historically the left and progressive forces have been the banner carriers against religion and against clerical rule, we find very much that now it is progressive to defend religion and to see a demand for equal rights for ex-Muslims as inciting hatred, Islamophobic, and anti-Muslim. And I don't think that's the case. I know there's huge amounts of anti-Muslim sentiment, there's huge amounts of racism. The system, a class system is one that's based on inequalities and perpetrates racism and sexism and so on and so forth. But to say that people who are fighting for the right to be atheists and to live to tell the tale, equating that with racism, I think, is a degradation of the anti-racist movement. I think, and what happens then is because, being an ex-Muslim is seen to be incitement against Muslims, there's really no empathy for those who are leaving Islam. There's a dehumanization that takes place of dissenters and a defense of the community no matter what happens. And I think we've seen a bit of it today, a defense of morality culture, which is really an extension of rape culture. If you're modesty culture. If you're immodest, then what happens to you is your fault. It's like blaming a girl for wearing a short skirt. Well, you wouldn't have been raped had you not worn that skirt. Modesty culture is exactly that. It's an extension of that. It gives permission to rape those who are immodest and only protects those who remain modest. So it's a hugely, very, very sexist sort of way of looking at women. And for it to be defended here, I think, again, we need to see how we go into our little things and start defending things no matter what, because I want to defend my culture, and if anybody says anything else, they're Islamophobic. And this accusation of Islamophobia, again, honestly, if I hear that term one more time, I'm going to scream. Okay. Because I've heard it so much here, everything is Islamophobic. Well, that's all we hear as well. Every time we go out to protest for our rights, we're accused of being Islamophobic. I mean, we went to Pride, and we held Allah is gay posters. And again, there's lots of Jesus is gay posters in Pride, but the police came and tried to remove our banners saying that they are offensive. Well, I'm sorry, I find religion offensive, but I don't deny people the right to think what they want, to believe in what they want. Can we also say that we think, homophobia in Islam is offensive? We're not telling you to be quiet, but we'd like to also be able to express that without this constant accusation of Islamophobia. And again, this is a protest in Pride. This is where people defend LGBT rights, where they go and criticize religion and its role in promoting homophobia. And of course, what happened right after is, their Muslim leaders complained to Pride about the placards. Now, the Muslim leaders are the East London Mosque and MEND. They're both Islamist organizations. The East London Mosque has invited tens of preachers that defend death penalty for LGBT. But they're suddenly Muslim leaders. I mean, I always say, if I was Muslim, I would be offended that these people are being considered our leaders. And so again, this accusation, and because of this, Pride took 8 months to decide whether they were going to allow us to march again next week in Pride London. So 8 months. Now, if the Westboro Baptist Church had complained to Pride about a Jesus is gay banner, would it have taken Pride 8 months to decide who was pro-LGBT rights and who was the homophobe? I think it wouldn't have taken them that long. And I think one of the things we're seeing is really victim blaming at its finest. It's the Islamists are the poor victims. If we call them out for homophobia, we're the ones that need to be silenced and stopped. And again, you've got left-wing journalists saying that we've adopted the same tactics as the Nazis, but I haven't seen any Nazis march at gay pride. Have you? I don't know. I didn't realize there were such great LGBT rights people. And also, a tactic of the Nazis marching in gay pride again, you know, the outrage of this statement, but that it's fine, and progressive people think that it's actually correct. And you know, there was another thing where we had the ex-Muslim because movement. We launched it thinking we'll get a couple of hundred people saying why they're ex-Muslim. We got, you know, 120,000 people in 65 countries saying why they were ex-Muslim. It was such an emotional thing for so many people. People said they sat in front of the computer and they cried. They poured out their hearts. You know, there were lots of tragic stories about what had happened to people. Lots of funny ones, like ex-Muslim because I'm a woman, ex-Muslim because no 72 virgins for me, ex-Muslim because pork and bacon. You know, so there was, you know, these are funny ones, but there were so many life-affirming ones. So many people said that they didn't feel alone for the first time in their lives. And then what happens? BBC Trending comes and says, they focus on how it's got to do with Muslim bashing. Why does it have to be Muslim bashing? When you defend LGBT rights, is it straight bashing? When you defend the right of women to vote, is it male bashing? Why is it when it comes to us that it becomes the bashing of Muslims? When in fact we had Muslims who also defended ex-Muslim because many of them had to cover their faces, which says a lot. They couldn't show their faces in support of ex-Muslims. And also we had Muslims walking with us in Pride. So why is it Muslim bashing? We see this again with fastifying. You know, there are people who are, in Somalia, did you know it's the death penalty if you eat during Ramadan? The death penalty, I mean, the height of absurdity. In Algeria, just this Ramadan, you have a young man being sentenced to 1 year in prison for eating during Ramadan. So we're saying, of course, you have a right to fast. You have a right to fast, but we also have a right not to fast, and to do it without being imprisoned and beaten and persecuted. And of course, here you've got Tunisians who've gone out. So you've got in Morocco, people picnicking. But here in London, we held protests in front of embassies that persecute people for eating during Ramadan. And you've got armed police coming and saying that we're offending the people in the Saudi embassy. Well, the fact that they've sentenced Raif Badawi to 10 years in prison offends me as well. And I have a right to protest. The fact that they persecute people for eating offends me as well. I'm not sure why it's always the offense of believers that seems to have more leeway than the offense the rest of us face. And why a protest on the streets of London has to have the rules of the Saudi embassy imposed on it. I think these are things we need to think about. And of course, you know, I've been involved in nude protests against the veil, against modesty culture. That's the Iranian flag. I've cut the Allah out of it and put something much better, in my opinion. That's my opinion. So what I want to say is when we talk about and you're quite okay with it, aren't you? Yes, thank you. So we don't need to go and start defending her because she can defend herself. But what I wanted to say this about nudity as well is that there was this idea that, you know, if you're veiled, you're modest. If you're unveiled, you're a whore. There's always this sort of discussion that goes around this. And also, immediately this idea that if you're nude, you're promoting pornography and you're promoting capitalism. No, because that's how degraded our bodies have become, that even when we use it freely, in political protest, in defense of women's rights, that it's seen to be something that's degrading. And I think we need to think about how we view women's bodies, that we stand here and we talk about being open and thinking, and we say modesty culture is great, and anyone who shows their body, there's something problematic about that. And I think that's one thing we need to think about. And also, you know, you've got something like the modesty ponchos in the US. You've got lots of things that culture, and I think it's an extension of rape culture. It defines which women are good and which women are bad, and I think it's something we need to oppose. And again, you discuss these issues, the accusation of Islamophobia. At Goldsmiths, I went to the university. I was invited by the atheist student groups there. Well, they wanted to hear what I had to say. And the Islamic Society tried to cancel my talk, and when they couldn't cancel it. They came and they disrupted it. They threatened people. They made pretended they're going to shoot people. They made explosion noises, on and on and on. And of course, after this situation, Goldsmiths contacted me 5 times, not to apologize for how I was treated, but to ask me to remove the video. The only evidence of what had happened at that event. And after this event, you had the LGBT society and the feminist society defending the Islamists. They said they're very charming fellows. Well, that's lovely. In fact, the president who disrupted my talk, they went into the archive of his tweets, which he had somehow deleted, and found so much homophobic nonsense that they had to remove him from his post. So, but again, the LGBT plus societies never decided that they're going to change their minds. They're still on board with the Islamic Society. And when I was barred from Warwick University, saying the things that I'm saying now, universities that every day invite hate preachers, that defend the death penalty for LGBT, that defend the death penalty for apostates, that defend stoning as a form of purifying society. These speakers can go and speak, but I can't go because I am inflammatory and because I could incite hatred. Again, this conflation of criticism of Islam and Islamism with an attack on Muslims. The Guardian wrote a whole piece on this, on why it was justified that I was barred, even though they had to reverse their decision because there was a lot of uproar over it. And this writer said that it's justified because criticism of religion, Islam especially, can be antisocial, even dangerous. And again, this very much goes to the crux of why I think there's a problem with the term Islamophobia. Because really, when you look at it, people are justifying silencing criticism of Islam rather than any real concern for racism. Because the reality is that if you want to stop racism in any society, you can't go about doing it by imposing blasphemy and apostasy rules. That would mean that there is no racism in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in Somalia, and blah, blah, blah. We know there's lots of racism in all of those societies. So blasphemy and apostasy isn't the way to stop racism. If you're really concerned about racism, it's a degradation of an anti-racist movement. And I do agree, though, that we are dangerous. The ex-Muslim movement is dangerous because it subverts the status quo. This is what Islamic states call us. But what I think is upsetting is that this is something that also progressive forces label us as, whereas they should be on our side fighting against the Islamists, which is our far right. You can't be just against some far right and not against other far rights. If you're against the far right, you need to be against the far right in all of its shapes and forms. And of course, you've got the Saudi embassy, the ambassador to the UN. He had said that one of the reasons why atheism is equated with terrorism in Saudi Arabia is because challenging Islamic rule or ideology is subversive and dangerous. And that's exactly why our movement is considered subversive and dangerous. And I think it's very much like other social and political movements that were seen to be dangerous and subversive at their time, or even still today. The other day, my sister took me to see a play on the Little Rock Nine 3 days ago in New York City. And these unbelievably brave African-American high school students who, as a test case, came to break segregation by entering an all-white high school. And if you look at the accusations against them of destroying the natural order of things, of ruining the society, these are all accusations against other social movements as well, including ex-Muslims. Why are you doing this? Why are you destroying our communities, and so on and so forth? These are a lot of things that we hear as well. And of course, if you look at the propaganda against those who were trying to bring about segregation. I mean, you might think this is a photo of the White House, but it's not. This is of that time, where there were people opposed to race mixing. And again, you know, these look very much like the Islamists when they're opposed to our attempts at defending apostasy and blasphemy, or ending segregation of genders, and so on and so forth. And if you look at the propaganda, for example, against the suffragettes, you know, this insistence on silencing them. This is an insistence that we ex-Muslims see all the time as well. You know, peace at last. They've shut down a suffragette from being able to speak. They're so dangerous that they need to be silenced. And this narrative that they were always destroying the natural order of things. They would bring chaos. You know, they're sitting there smoking now and eating chocolates while the poor man is washing shirts and looking after the baby. And this is what happens when women vote.
That's what I've done all day.
And of course, this thing that is anti-male, you know, defending the right to women's vote is anti-male. I want to vote, but my wife won't let me, because if she votes, now he's never going to be able to vote again, you know, poor old man. So, sort of making it seem as if it's either racism or sexism or anti-male and so on and so forth as a way of, you know, pushing back that movement. And the other thing which was interesting is the suffragettes were always seen to be traitors, yeah? And it's this idea that you are always a traitor if you defend peace during wartime. And this is something ex-Muslims see all the time, you know, the idea that we're native informants. And again, you know, when you look at people as traitors, there's a problem, because you're no longer able to see dissent within a community, because if everybody doesn't think the same, anyone who thinks differently is automatically considered a traitor. So what happens is you're not seeing political and social movements, you're not seeing class politics, you're not seeing the resistance and dissent that takes place. So these sort of accusations, you know, of course there are neocon ex-Muslims, as there are neocon Muslims. You know, there are neocon Christians and neocon atheists. You know, just because I'm an atheist, I don't agree with Sam Harris. He's for Muslim profiling, I'm for open borders. There's politics and choices and decisions that people make, but when you see them as a community and a homogenous community, it gives you the right to call people traitors. And if you think about it, you know, Nasreen Malik's just done a thing, Islam's new native informants, you know. And when you sort of think about it, it's like white people supporting the civil rights movement. They were called race traitors, weren't they? Or you've got people who, the suffragettes again, you know, called traitors. So this is something that again is a way of pushing back this movement and giving it a sort of, so that it lacks the importance that it really deserves. And of course, I want to just add here that bigotry does exist, but I think Islamophobia is a bogus term, because criticism of religion and the religious right is not the same as bigotry against people. Ex-Muslims also face bigotry. They also face travel bans. I mean, my background is from Iran. I was born and raised in Iran. So that's not something that is only the purview of Muslims. Lots of people other than Muslims also face bigotry. Bigotry is a much larger issue than this. And of course it kills, it destroys. But saying that stopping criticism of Islam will stop racism is, as I said before, the degradation of the anti-racist movement. And in a sense, it's outrageous to think that the anti-racist movement has now been reduced to respecting identities. That's all the anti-racist movement is now all about. And the other thing that we need to think about is how identity politics has helped to give legitimacy to white identity politics as well. If you have this argument that cultures are homogenous, they need to be protected, this has aided in the rise of xenophobia and anti-migrant sentiment, because Trump and the white nationalists in Europe are also using this argument. They're saying we need to protect our culture against the hordes of immigrants and refugees that are coming into our countries. This identity politics is helping the rise of white identity politics. It's based on the same fundamentals when you think about it. And that's why I was saying that the issue of identity and superiority are two sides of a double-edged sword. And when you have this sort of argument, where, you know, everybody's got their own identity, we don't have any common humanity anymore, we have to protect our own. That is when, you know, you can let migrants drown in the waters, no one bats an eyelid, you separate toddlers from their parents. It's the height of defending your culture versus, you know, the invading hordes. It's a politics of superiority and difference. And one of the interesting things is the politics of difference has always been a politics of the racists, you know, the biological theory of difference. They're different. They need to have different rights and rules. And now this difference is very often expressed in cultural and religious terms. It's that same sort of really racist politics that's now suddenly very progressive. And I think it harms us because what it does is it makes us go into our little groups and it doesn't allow us to see our common humanity, to work together, and also to show real solidarity, because solidarity would suddenly be what, colonialism now, or, you know, appropriation and blah, 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 you know. So from my point of view, I think, oh, there's Trump. It doesn't fit in here, but I just thought I'd put that in there.
The Time magazine cover, the one before?
Yeah.
You shot the kid against Trump, it'll be in there. It's the magazine cover, it's my Facebook.
Oh, yes.
It's a killer. Yeah, the kid photographer.
So I'm ending now. I know you guys, oh, it's just 2 more pages. You guys, it's almost finished, 25 minutes, almost finished. So I just want to say that from my point of view, you know, the ex-Muslim movement is about demanding equality within a universal and secular framework. I want to defend secularism because secularism is just a framework. It's nothing more. To say that it's about patriarchy, it's in fact, it is only in a secular framework that women's rights can be respected, the rights of minorities can be respected. It's not about anything other than saying religion has to be separate from the state. That's all it says. It's a framework. To say that it has something to do with imposing patriarchy or men run it, it's not recognizing the reality of what secularism means, especially for minorities within minorities and for women's rights and for LGBT rights. So I think a defense of secularism, universal values is hugely important. I think we need to recognize identity politics isn't working. We need to go back to old-fashioned politics where it was about social and political movements, class politics, and seeing our common humanity. The last thing I want to say is that we're often, one of the things that the ex-Muslim Council was often accused of is being too political. And you know, people want to just socialize, and can we just not talk so much about politics and go naked in the streets and cut out eyelaws and stuff. But I think, you know, for us, we understand the importance of creating social networks. We also help 300 people every month. We have support groups, we have meetups, social events, going to fun fairs and picnics and so on and so forth. But you cannot really begin to socialize if you're considered subhuman, you know, and I think that's something that people are beginning to realize now 11 years on. You can't and sit at the counter you want unless there is a civil rights movement fighting for integration. I think you have to see, we don't all have to be political, but politics also matters in this fight. And finally, I just want to say that at a time when we've got identity politics degrading anti-racism and to a point where it's all about respecting cultures and religions and not about equality and human rights, when you've got neoliberalism working hand in hand with the religious right in order to not only cut services but also transfer state services to faith-based groups. So you've got faith-based services now, faith-based schools, faith-based courts. You know, you're Muslim, go to the Sharia court. You're Jewish, go to the Beth Din. And I think that's why it's important to see it as a community in protest, a way of reaffirming our universal values, anti-racism and secularism. We need to fight on as many fronts as possible. We don't just fight on one. To change laws, end blasphemy and apostasy laws, for common humanity across borders and boundaries, and for equality, not privilege. I think that's key. And finally, we're not asking for anyone's permission. We're here, we're kafir, get used to it.